Do, 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 do. Fittingly enough, My True Love Gave to Me was released in December 1993. Under the Z-Fave line, a subsidiary of Kensington Publishing Corporation, the parent company of Zebra Books. Its very creation aiming at the lucrative YA horror market, dominated by Scholastic's point horror books. In the late 80s into the early 90s, R.L. Stine's Fear Street series had brought the teen horror genre into higher popularity. The themes were prototypical American teen drama with a murderous twist of clownery. Scream was Z-Fave's Kmart version of Fear Street that had a short and pitiful run in the early 90s. Unlike Fear Street, though, the series features a host of writers with standalone stories. The most obscure and pricey of the Scream series is the Christmas-themed feature My True Love Gave to Me by Eric Weiner. In a quest to procure all YA horror Christmas books, I discovered a sole copy of it on eBay for around $25 in December 2019. Now, paying that much for a horror book, let alone a YA horror book, isn't typical, but it was one of those Christmas presents to myself kind of things, which I'm happy with the purchase, because the following year now, searching for it online, you would have to pay an absurd amount for it, because even if you had the money, you can't find it. There's one of those money laundering type of listings for $500 for it on eBay. Other than that, you can't really find it. It was written by writer Eric Weiner, who had other contributions in the 90s, from the famous Ghostwriter series, as well as clue books aimed at a YA audience. From the About the Author page in the back of the book, Eric Weiner lives with his playwright wife, Sherry, in New York City. He is a full-time writer who is currently working on his next young adult horror novel for Scream, which is entitled Deadly Detention, and will be published in June 1994. Eric loves hearing from his readers, and you may write to him via Zebra Books. Please include a self-addressed stamp envelope if you wish a response. The fruition of Deadly Detention came in gaudy hot pink. Often the value of a horror paperback is tied to its obscurity and cover art. It hangs proudly in my tree like a cherished familial ornament. A silver glass bulb dangles upon the festively lit Christmas tree. Holly, our lead girl, flashes an aghast look reflected in the orb of the ornament. A clip-point knife aims in striking position in front of Holly's face, dripping blood. Despite being visible only from the neck up, she exudes 90s fashion with her silver hoop earrings. Now, the title, My True Love Gave to Me, is an obvious allusion to the classic Christmas song, The 12 Days of Christmas. And thusly, our 17-year-old lead character, Holly, is harassed on the 12 days of Christmas with 12 different hideous gifts. The prose reads in first person as the insipid diary of a vacuous girl with delusions of believing she's Marissa Tomei's gorgeous doppelganger. Every other character in this is either super jealous of her or madly, homicidally in love with her. We're treated to highbrow literature like, I never regretted making out with any guy except for Rick. On the first day of Christmas, my true love gave to me an audio cartridge tied to the tree branch outside of her window, which happened to be a pear tree. She pops the tape into like her Walkman, and it's like screaming or something. So disappointing. The setting is like a snowy New York, outside of the city, outside of the boroughs. So you could catch on. Most of these gifts on each different day is kind of like a pun on the song. So a lot of the pranks are just practical and not too violent to start. So she's 17 years old. Her dad just ended up in the hospital after throwing out his back in the opening scene. And she's home alone with her 13-year-old brother, who's kind of just like a silly goofball and plays his own kind of pranks on her. And she's dating the captain of the wrestling team. He's a big jock and whatnot, strong guy. And she has two friends that are Melody and Anne, both jealous of her, of course. By the time we get to the third gag, it's 3 French men stabbed in New York City. Just a news article. It doesn't actually happen or anything. Now, Holly has many male orbiters of various social types, like I was saying, and the fourth one, they're hanging out at the mall, a typical YA horror setting in the 90s. That's where you hung out. And so the song is, the fourth day is 4 calling birds. This one ends up being 4 falling turds at the mezzanine at the mall. Holly's a member of the Swans, which is the name of their choir group, and they sing Christmas hymns throughout. And so they end up going ice skating, and lo and behold, the ice breaks, so we have the Swans a-swimming. No one ends up dying from that, but she ends up being bedeviled in many ways. The amount of red herrings used makes it a bit puzzling to figure it out, and I thought I had it figured it out. Most YA horrors have a simple formula, and I thought it was following the beat of the jealous friend. So her dad ends up out of the hospital and back with her, and he learns about all the harassment that she's faced. So he devises a plan to go to their upstate New York cabin in the woods, in a good wintry setting. She's instructed not to tell any of her friends. Unsurprisingly, her boyfriend Jeffrey shows up like a creep coming out of the woods saying his car broke down. He was told that by her friend Anne where the cabin was. And at one point he ends up with a VHS tape on him, and the dad actually hired a private investigator, so he's kind of like patrolling the place and finds him, and then later they're like playing Monopoly, and he's upstairs and he finds him like in a room alone, like trying to hide the next gag, because how she was usually got these were she would receive a present mysteriously, would just show up. But there's still roughly 40 pages left, so you know it's not Jeffrey. But he gets framed for it and gets ostracized by her and pushed away. Moving on, 10 Lords a-Leaping, that ends up being 10 Floors a-Leaping. Melody, one of her other close friends, fell out of the window and left behind a suicide note claiming and taking the blame for all the torture that Holly has faced because of her own jealousy. Despite Melody's death, there's still 2 more days of the 12 days of Christmas. Number 11 ends up being on Christmas Eve. They decide to open up a present. That present ends up being number 11. And it ends up being Vipers Viping. In closing, I will go over the recap of all the characters and the final spoiled ending. So if you plan on reading the book, tune out now. So out of her 2 close friends, Melody is now dead with a suicide note claiming that she was the one who terrorized Holly. Next, Anne, the one who was super jealous and who I really suspected as being the arch villain in all of this, is who Holly ends up going over to next. And she starts playing her drum set for 12 drummers drumming. And then Holly's like, oh, I'm still getting the gifts. That means the killer's still alive. It's got to be you, Anne. She freaks out. She leaves. She goes back to her house. Lo and behold, now we're going to go over the males that were in her life. There was the crass bad boy Rick. There was another one whose parents own a mortuary, and that's how she ended up getting 5 fingers for the 5 golden rings in a hideous gag. Then there's Jeffrey, her boyfriend, who she accused of, who got caught red-handed with a VHS tape up in their upstate New York cabin. Then, finally, Danny from England. So in the final pages of the book, Danny from England happens to show up. This is her former boyfriend who calls on occasion throughout the book, claiming he's going to college over there, and they still kind of like each other, but there's a distance. But he was under the impression that they were exclusive and they were still dating, and he was still madly in love with her. And Holly led them to believe that there was no one really else involved. But he happened to come home during the Christmas break for 2 weeks, giving him the leeway of 12 days of Christmas. With that time, he incurred horror and bewilderment. He even acknowledged he killed Melody to make it more memorable. So like I said, usually YA horrors are more predictable, and you could pick up the signs of who's a red herring and who has hidden motives that will end up being the killer. But in this, I was completely shocked. Mostly because you're bombarded with her ex-boyfriends and plenty of red herrings to begin with. So Jeffrey kind of takes her out on a date and slowly pulls back the curtain on his villainy. He takes her to the graveyard and elucidates all of the mayhem that he caused and admits to it. For all the horrible writing that you have to endure, this is a really great ending. He shocks me here when he pulls out a gun and ends up shooting himself because he was madly in love with her and he couldn't take it anymore and he couldn't take the betrayal. So yes, suicide in a YA horror, very grim. The final titillation from this one comes in the epilogue. It's several months later, Valentine's Day. She talks about how all of the whole cast went to Danny's funeral, the guy who totally set up all the murder, and how they're all doing better now. And she ends up looking in her locker, and down she finds a white envelope similar to the ones that she's been finding, and it says, "My true love. To my true love," something like that. You know, the whole stupid gag. And no signature. So it just leaves it on a slight bit of horror. Before I ended, I thought I'd read a public review from Paul's review on Goodreads from February 22nd, 2015. He read the book, gave it a 4 out of 5 stars. Let's see. While it wasn't something that makes me think twice while reading the book, it's a decent book with plenty of scares and action with a fun premise. Not much I can say about the main character. She's the typical teenage girl who has some relationship problem, and that's all I can say about her. However, I did get sick of her accusing the person throughout the book, which really grew repetitive. One particular side character I dislike is Holly's best friend, who seemed to treat Holly like dirt for no particular reason sometimes, and even her reason for instigating the act just seems more petty than reasonable. That was Anne, who I figured ended up being the killer because it was unreasonable. She really hated her and was jealous throughout. So, back to his final 2 paragraphs of the review. I would say the gifts Holly received from the killer range from actually creepy to standard. There's one gift I found disgusting, but overall they're mostly tame. I don't know if he's talking about the fort or the 5 dead fingers that Rick got from the mortuary or the flying turds. But anyway, back to his final paragraph here. The book may provide chilling moments and seems to have some twist and turn every chapter, so I think the book's worth a read. I have this app covering it, so I can't really see. The only thing that's keeping something from being perfect, or the book from being perfect, is that the characters are interesting. I don't quite agree with that, but that was the longest review I found on Goodreads of it, because there aren't too many reviews of it. This has been a Pulp Arcanum segment from the 2020 Christmas special. Search your podcast app for the full episode.